They say love finds you when you least expect it. I had always thought those were the words of lonely romantics trying to make sense of empty hours, but perhaps they carried a truth that had only been waiting for me to stumble into it. I was 32 years old, heir to one of the most well-known family estates in New England, but despite the appearances of elegance and control, I was anything but fulfilled. My mother had passed away from breast cancer 2 years prior, and my father, once the imposing and respected head of the Wren family, had retreated into silence and seclusion. His world had dimmed with hers, and in his grief he handed the reins of everything, our estate, the hotel group, the philanthropic foundation, into my hands. I didn't resist. I didn't ask for time or support. I took the weight and wore it like armor. It was at the annual Wren Foundation Gala, an opulent evening hosted at our ancestral estate for donors and local dignitaries, that I met him. James Blackwell. He had been a last-minute addition to the guest list, invited by a friend of a board member, someone I barely knew. He arrived in a perfectly tailored navy suit, with a smile that knew its own charm but didn't overplay it. James seemed to be unlike the others. He didn't ask about the estate. He didn't mention the hotels or the family fortune. He asked about me. About the woman behind the press photos, the one who disappeared from public view whenever she wasn't expected to host or give a speech. He told me I seemed tired and asked if anyone ever looked after me. No one had asked that before. And perhaps because I was so emotionally starved, I mistook his observation for intimacy. Within a month, we were spending weekends together at our seaside property in Kennebunkport. He made me laugh. He cooked, read poetry aloud, walked with me in the woods behind the manor, listened to my fears without ever changing the subject. He didn't push. He simply stayed. When I had a panic attack in the middle of the night, he held me without asking questions. When I wanted to be alone, he left me space. Slowly, I began to think perhaps love wasn't a lost cause after all. 6 months after that gala night, I said yes when he asked me to marry him under a canopy of white orchids in our garden. The engagement ring wasn't ostentatious, just a simple, classic diamond set in platinum, delicate and timeless, like something that had always belonged to me. There was resistance, of course. My family's legal counsel advised caution. Prenups were discussed. We married on a cool September morning. It was a modest ceremony by our family's standards. Only 150 guests, all seated in our orchard where golden leaves had just begun to fall. I wore my mother's veil, and my father, though frail and emotionally distant, managed to walk me down the aisle. James cried as I approached, or at least he pretended to. After the wedding, we moved into the guest house on the west side of the estate, a modern stone and glass structure that offered us privacy while keeping us close to the center of operations. James declined any formal role in the business, saying he didn't want to meddle. Instead, he took on a part-time consulting job for a real estate firm downtown, leaving him with ample time to join me at charity events and family functions. But beneath the laughter and the delicate kisses was a subtle shift, one that only became apparent when I began to let go of my need to be constantly distracted. As the months passed, I started to notice how his questions became more pointed. He showed sudden interest in certain family documents, particularly those involving land titles, estate boundaries, and shareholding structures. At first, I thought he was just trying to learn about my world. Still, something inside me, something primal and protective, began to stir. One morning, I noticed that a small antique key I had kept in my jewelry box was missing. It was the key to my mother's old desk in the study, a desk that now held sensitive documents regarding our charitable foundations, real estate trusts, and private holdings. I searched the house, but the key reappeared 2 days later on my vanity table, as if it had never been gone. That night, I lay awake beside a man who claimed to love me, and for the first time, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I had made a mistake that would cost me more than my pride. I had spent my life building walls to protect my family name, my father's legacy, my mother's ideals. But in the end, I may have handed the keys to our fortress to someone who had never intended to guard it. There was no dramatic betrayal yet, no screaming matches, no canceled checks or caught affairs. Just a growing silence between us, a tension woven into daily rituals. He smiled, but I no longer knew what it meant. He held my hand, but it felt like possession, not affection. The man I had once seen as a refuge was becoming a stranger in tailored suits, moving through my life with too much grace and too little transparency. Still, I said nothing. I wasn't ready to know the truth, not yet. I needed more than suspicion. I needed clarity. And so I began to plan, not out of malice or revenge, but out of necessity. I would give him the benefit of the doubt while quietly preparing for the possibility that I had married a man not for love, but for legacy. The first step was to contact someone I trusted beyond blood and marriage. My mother's old attorney, a private man who had managed her personal affairs with quiet devotion for over 20 years. I asked for discretion. I asked for surveillance. I asked him to find out if James Blackwell truly was who he claimed to be. By then, the winter snow had begun to melt along the garden paths, and the roses my mother once loved were starting to breathe again under a sky still gray with doubt. I stood at the window of the guest house one afternoon, watching James from a distance as he spoke on the phone in hushed tones, pacing near the fountain where we had once danced under fairy lights on our wedding night. I thought of how love can sometimes look like safety, even when it's a snare. I thought of how a man can hold your hand while mapping the coordinates of your downfall. And I thought, perhaps for the first time in my life, that I might be fighting not just for my future, but for the truth about everything I believed in. What began as a perfect love story was beginning to crack under the weight of silence. I wasn't sure yet what I would find, but I had finally stopped pretending. Now it was time to see if he ever truly meant anything at all. I had always believed that deception wore a mask of chaos. Reckless lies, heated confrontations, undeniable betrayals played out in public or written in secret. But when it came, my deception arrived quietly. It wore polished shoes and a wedding band. It brought me coffee in the morning, touched the small of my back as we walked through gala entrances, and whispered tenderness through actions rehearsed to perfection. The private investigator I had hired, through my mother's former legal advisor, was meticulous. He kept everything off the books and off the grid. I gave him no specifics at first, only the name, James Blackwell. I didn't want to taint the results with bias, even though my instincts were no longer whispering, they were screaming. In return, I asked for nothing but discretion and truth. James had developed routines that at first comforted me but now unnerved me with their precision. He left the house each morning at 9:15 a.m., claiming to consult for a boutique real estate firm in Cambridge. He always returned at 5:30, never a minute too early or too late. He wore the same 5 suits on rotation and never brought paperwork home. His phone remained face down when near me and always locked with a fingerprint I didn't have access to. I began to observe from a distance, recording these patterns in my journal like a scientist cataloging behaviors. I made copies of the estate records and updated my will to include contingency clauses. I had the legal teams revise inheritance structures in subtle ways, under the guise of estate optimization. And through all of this, I smiled at him over dinner, laughed at his half-hearted jokes, and kissed his cheek like a woman still in love. Then the first file arrived from the investigator. It was simple, an employment history. James had never held a full-time position at the real estate firm. In fact, he was not officially affiliated with them at all. He had used the company's address as a forwarding location for a shell LLC registered in Delaware, and all traces of actual revenue or transactions from that entity led to a dry trail of nothingness. Further reports followed, each revealing pieces of a calculated puzzle. Before me, there had been others, 2 women in particular. One was a recent widow from Connecticut with 3 beachfront properties and no children. The second was an heiress to a family vineyard in upstate New York. Both women had withdrawn from public life shortly after their short relationships with James ended. But there was more. James had been seen meeting with someone, a man I recognized only through the investigator's photos. My father's cousin, Charles Wren, the man who had long resented my place in the family legacy, the one who smirked during our wedding toast, who questioned every decision I made on the board, who had once told me to marry a man who understands power, not poetry. Now, that same man was seen twice in the company of James at a private club in the city. I found myself unable to sleep in the same bed. I began to claim migraines and retreat to the master bedroom in the main house, blaming humidity or work stress. James said nothing, perhaps relieved at the distance, perhaps sensing my withdrawal but too cautious to confront it. I watched him from the windows sometimes, standing alone in the garden at dusk, holding a glass of wine with the posture of someone rehearsing a role. I wondered what he told himself. I turned my attention to Charles, quietly freezing his voting rights within our family foundation and limiting access to accounts he once oversaw. I had the legal team draft an emergency succession clause that would take effect should any trustee be implicated in estate manipulation. No public moves, just small, invisible shifts in the chessboard of wealth and bloodlines. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was reclaiming a throne I had sat on politely but never ruled with intent. As winter turned to spring, the roses began to bloom again, my mother's roses, pale and strong. I spent more time in the garden pruning, cutting, watching the petals unfold in slow defiance of the frost. I found healing in their quiet resilience. I remembered my mother's hands guiding mine, her soft voice warning me that love, when chosen poorly, can be a weapon sharpened over time. I had not listened then, but now I heard her in every whisper of wind that bent the branches gently toward the sun. The investigator's final file came one morning wrapped in a discreet leather folio. Inside was a single-page summary of a meeting between James and a notary from another state, someone who specialized in complex asset transfers and inheritance bypasses. The implication was chilling. James had been exploring how to leverage spousal access to the estate through survivorship clauses. I stared at that page for a long time, then placed it on the hearth and burned it, not out of fear, but resolve. I knew now with certainty what I had to do. But I also understood that revenge, when cold, must be served not with rage but with elegance. The world would not see me fall apart. It would not see me as the broken wife of a conman. No, I would rise through this, and I would do it wearing my name like armor. I did not tell anyone, not even my father. He remained in his quarters, distant but peaceful, unaware of the war being fought just beyond his window. He had given me his empire in grief. Now I would preserve it in quiet fury. James continued his act with remarkable consistency. He kissed my forehead in front of guests, held my hand at church functions, and asked how my board meetings went. He pretended to be proud. He nodded at everything I said, laughed in the right places, stood beside me for every photo. But I no longer saw a husband. I saw a mask stretched too thin, a man whose performance was nearing its final curtain. One night I stood in the study alone, running my fingers along the carved edge of my mother's desk. I unlocked the drawer and retrieved the family charter, an aged parchment protected behind glass, symbolizing our control over the Wren Trust. I read it line by line, whispering each word in silence like a prayer. And then I closed the drawer and locked it, not out of tradition, but out of survival. The game had shifted. I was no longer the woman who married for love. I was the woman who would unmake a marriage for legacy. Not because I craved wealth or power, but because I finally understood what it meant to be preyed upon under the illusion of affection. And so I began the next stage, not confrontation, but orchestration. I collected every document, secured every asset, rewrote every clause. My will now stated that no transfer of ownership could occur without the signature of a trustee council, which included the family lawyer, my father, and my mother's former advisor. I converted all properties jointly held into separate trusts. I knew he would act soon. Men like him don't wait forever. And when he did, I would be ready, not as his wife, but as his reckoning. It's strange how pain reshapes time. Days that used to feel full and swift now moved like thick syrup, heavy and slow. The rhythm of my life had been reduced to concealment and observation, no longer living in the light, but operating in deliberate shadows. James remained steady in his performance, as though he believed the mask he wore was indistinguishable from truth. But now that I had seen the cracks, I could no longer unsee them. I no longer mistook his compliments for kindness, nor his attentiveness for love. He wasn't loving me, he was curating me, grooming my trust, managing my perception. But where he thought I was drifting along with naivety, I was in fact gathering proof of intent. He still didn't know that I knew. Weeks passed in quiet planning. Every day I reviewed our legal documents, our accounts, our structures. Every night I added to a private dossier I kept hidden in a hollow compartment beneath the floorboards of my mother's old studio. In that folder were records of James's movements, his shell companies, his suspicious meetings with my cousin Charles, and, most damning of all, the notarial records of his attempt to consult on estate transfers that would bypass family trustees. One morning, the investigator delivered something different, not just surveillance, but substance. Hidden audio discreetly captured through a contact he had planted near Charles Wren. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. My husband's voice discussing legal language, referencing my willingness to sign over legacy rights under emotional duress, and mentioning a clause that would take effect in case of involuntary disability. I didn't flinch as I listened. I didn't weep. I now had proof that they were planning not just theft, but usurpation. They weren't waiting for me to be generous or gullible. They were preparing to make me legally irrelevant, and perhaps more. There was a coldness in James's tone that chilled me far deeper than the words themselves. This wasn't a man who had merely stopped loving me. This was a man who had never planned to love me in the first place. I had been a target, not a partner. A gateway to legacy, not a companion. Still, I told no one, not the board, not my lawyers, not even my father, who had lately returned to mild lucidity, wandering the halls of the estate like a ghost learning to breathe again. He didn't need to carry this burden. It was mine, and I would carry it to its rightful conclusion. I shifted my strategy. I began speaking more openly about succession planning during family events, planting the idea that I was considering a generational transition. I mentioned retiring early, focusing on writing or philanthropy. It was bait, and I said it carefully. James's ears perked every time I floated the idea, his eyes narrowing just slightly, small flickers of anticipation he couldn't hide. I knew then that he was preparing for the moment I'd hand over something I never would. It was then that the contract surfaced, not from James directly, but from a slip in Charles's chain of secrecy. The investigator's contact, a temporary clerk in the legal firm Charles used, managed to capture an image of a document that chilled me to the bone. A private agreement between James Blackwell and Charles Wren, drafted months before my wedding, signed and notarized. The contract detailed their understanding. James would marry me under the pretense of love and support, build trust over the first 2 years, and eventually persuade me to grant Charles a 35% advisory stake in the Wren Estate Foundation. A non-voting stake on paper, but with buried clauses that would allow Charles to override board decisions if certain conditions were met. What I held in my hands was not only betrayal, it was conspiracy. Not just deception, but a formalized plan to strip me of power, identity, and legacy. My marriage had been a merger carefully negotiated behind my back. I was not a woman loved. I was a woman acquired. The cruelty of it didn't even anger me. It only sharpened my focus. I no longer sought protection. I sought retribution. The next few weeks I became something else entirely. I held parties. I attended charity auctions. I smiled beside James in photographs, letting the world believe we were thriving. I sent gifts to Charles on his birthday. I laughed when people asked when we were planning children, and behind closed doors I executed a strategy of surgical precision. I moved assets. I rewrote legal structures. I converted the estate trust into a closed, irrevocable foundation with a 3-signatory release condition. Myself, my father, and a neutral trustee selected by our legal team. I notified the Preservation Council that the estate was to be reclassified under historic protection law, locking any attempt at private development. Every night I returned to the guest house beside James and listened to his shallow breathing as he slept. I wondered how he slept so soundly, with a heart so hollow. I wondered if he dreamed of my downfall, or if he dreamed of villas in the south of France, bought with the money of a woman he never kissed with sincerity. I wondered if he had ever felt guilt, or if men like him had long since buried that function. I kept up the act until the night I received word that the contract between him and Charles had been finalized for execution. They were going to move soon, likely within the next 60 days, using a fabricated investment opportunity to pressure me into co-signing a limited transfer. A small step, legally insignificant on its face, but sufficient to create precedents. And once precedent existed, they would exploit it like termites through wood. But they had waited too long. They had underestimated the girl they thought had grown up too sheltered to see the war behind the veil. I met with my lawyers in secret. I laid out the entire plan, presented the contract, the audio, the proof of financial entanglement between James and Charles. I requested an internal inquiry under our family council. I notified the bank of potential fraud, requesting a proactive block on asset movement pending investigation. And I filed a petition to freeze all jointly held marital accounts, citing suspicion of predatory financial behavior, quietly, without a sound. James noticed when his credit card was declined at a dinner in the city. He called me that night with concern in his voice, but I didn't pick up. Instead, I sat in the conservatory, surrounded by orchids and low light, and wrote the final line in my private journal. "Let him come. I am no longer the hunted." And when he returned that night, standing in the doorway with confusion masked as anger, I greeted him with a soft smile. He still didn't know, but soon he would, because now the chessboard was set and I held every piece he never thought I knew how to move. The storm hadn't broken yet, but I could feel the air thickening with the weight of what was coming. There would be fallout, there would be headlines, there would be silence from those who once watched and whispered but said nothing. But I would survive it all, not just intact, but elevated. Because the man who pretended to love me had underestimated the strength of the woman who refused to be broken. The day the final piece fell into place, the sky above the estate was clear, cloudless, unbothered by the quiet war waging beneath it. I remember the way the light filtered through the windows of the East Solarium that morning, warm, gentle, golden, as if the universe itself dared to pretend that nothing was amiss. But something had shifted in the air, something beyond paperwork and shadows. I could feel it in my bones, in the quiet tension that gripped the silence between every breath I took. After months of preparation, I had begun to execute the strategy that would leave him exposed. Not publicly, at least not yet. That would come later. First, I needed to contain him, to render him powerless, to unravel every avenue he and Charles had carved behind my back. But I wasn't content with defense. I wanted offense, not revenge for love lost, that love had never truly existed, but justice for trust manipulated, for a family name nearly handed over to those who saw legacy as currency. So I began laying traps, not for his physical movements, but for his intentions. I commissioned a set of documents that appeared on the surface to be transfers of minor estate holdings. I left them on my desk in view unsigned, and I waited. The estate had become a stage. Every hallway now felt like a corridor in a theater, every dinner table a set, every shared glance a performance. I walked beside James through our lives like an actress with a role perfected in silence. I let him believe he still held me in his grip. I let him kiss my cheek. I let him hold my waist in photographs, but inside I was already gone. He was holding a shell I no longer inhabited. The next evening, I received a message from our family lawyer. Charles had attempted to schedule a surprise emergency vote on the Wren Foundation board, proposing a resolution to expand the advisory council to include new strategic partners. That phrase, though wrapped in corporate gloss, was the echo of the plan James and he had conceived together, the very clause embedded in their private contract. But the request had been blocked. That night James grew colder, not in a way most people would notice, but I did. He came home later than usual. His smile was a shade too sharp. He asked too little about my day and too much about my upcoming meetings. His presence no longer felt like a performance of love. It had become surveillance. I wondered if Charles had called him already, warned him that something was wrong, that the path they had so carefully constructed was now barricaded from within. I pretended not to notice. I moved through my routines as if nothing had changed, reviewing contracts, tending the gardens, hosting our seasonal charity brunch for the local medical trust. I took James's arm as we greeted donors. I let him raise a toast. I smiled for photographs as he placed his hand on the small of my back, and I smiled even more knowing it would be the last time he ever touched me in public as my husband. The brunch was a final stage, a last display of illusion. I invited Charles as well, knowing he would come. His ego wouldn't allow him to miss a moment to show his face beside the legacy he still hoped to seize. But the moment he stepped onto the grounds, I saw it, the flicker in his eyes, the hesitation in his gait. He already knew something had gone wrong. He was scanning for confirmation, watching me, searching for signs of weakness or defiance. I gave him neither. Later that evening, I convened a private meeting with the full Wren Foundation Advisory Council. I presented the full evidence, audio, the notarized contract between James and Charles, bank transaction records, and a timeline of events tracing back to the night I first met James. The room was silent as I unfolded each page, each photograph, each betrayal. My father sat at the head of the table, older now, quieter than he once was, but with a fire rekindled in his gaze. The council voted unanimously to remove Charles from all advisory and board roles, effective immediately. Legal action was prepared, and a private investigator was authorized to turn everything over to the authorities. James's role, however, would be handled more delicately. I had made it clear from the beginning. I didn't want just a legal separation. I wanted his exposure. I wanted the world to see the man he truly was, behind the masks and smiles and tailored suits. The next morning, I left a printed copy of the contract between him and Charles on his desk in our guest house office. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. The paper was enough. The silence that followed was more honest than any words he had ever spoken to me. By midday, he had vanished. His clothes remained. His phone, however, was gone. The front gate logs recorded a departure at 11:07 a.m. He never returned. I didn't chase. I didn't call. I merely watched the security footage once, noting the stiffness in his walk, the tension in his jaw as he stepped into the black car that had been waiting for him. He looked back once, not at me, but at the estate. He had never wanted the woman. He had wanted the world she stood upon. In the days that followed, legal proceedings commenced. Charles attempted to deny everything until the documents and recordings were delivered in full to the press. The headlines were immediate. Wren heirs husband in conspiracy scandal. Private contract exposes plot to seize estate. Journalists circled like vultures, and I fed them nothing but carefully worded statements about transparency, integrity, and the need to protect legacies from betrayal. The court filings confirmed what I already knew. James had never been the man he pretended to be. His credentials were shallow, his ventures fake, his charm a carefully tuned weapon. But he had underestimated something vital. He thought I was a woman shaped only by inheritance. He never imagined I had inherited more than land and wealth. He didn't know I had inherited fire. The estate became quieter after that. The press faded. Charles resigned from all public roles. James disappeared. Rumors placed him in Europe, possibly in hiding, possibly chasing his next mark. But I no longer cared. He was gone, and the ghost of what we never truly had left with him. But I remained. The gardens grew again. The staff returned to normalcy. The foundation, cleansed of poison, began new projects, focused not on expansion but healing. I turned the old guest house into a retreat for women recovering from financial abuse. I opened my mother's art studio as a gallery to fund local arts programs. I no longer built for legacy. I built for meaning. Sometimes I walk the paths James once wandered. I sit beneath the arbor where he proposed, and I remember how even illusions can be beautiful for a moment. But I do not weep. I do not wish to undo it, because without the pain I would not have found my strength. I now know that love, real love, is not a theater. It is not a contract or a strategy or a weapon to be used in shadows. It is a light that cannot be counterfeited. And until I find that kind of love, I will walk alone, with my head held high, surrounded by the truth I bled to earn. Even in victory, silence can be disorienting. After months of constant tension, of vigilance sharpened like a blade against my spine, the sudden stillness of James's absence was not peace, it was a void. Trauma rarely leaves with the traitor. It stays in the walls, in the spaces where secrets once festered. But I kept moving. I had no interest in drowning in bitterness. I returned to my work at the Wren Foundation, launched new preservation projects, attended meetings with a renewed clarity. I had gone to war and survived, but I hadn't merely protected the family name, I had evolved it. The board meetings were no longer filled with men who spoke over me. The staff no longer whispered doubts behind my back. I had proven myself. And then, just as I began to feel that sense of renewal take root, it came, slow, deliberate, insidious. James wasn't finished. I learned of it not through confrontation, but through bureaucracy. A letter arrived in a cream envelope bearing the logo of a regional law firm I recognized from our years attending business summits. At first, I assumed it was a donation request, or perhaps a formal invitation. But when I opened it, I found a stack of carefully typed documents, clean and cruel. James was suing me. The grounds were absurd on the surface. He claimed a share of marital assets accrued during the time we were legally bound. He had hired a litigator skilled in estate law, one who had made a name for herself representing disenfranchised spouses in complex separations. His petition stated that although our marriage was short, he had played a foundational role in the growth and strategic oversight of the foundation's recent expansion. And worse, he requested access to internal financials for audit, implying potential misconduct in how I had reorganized the estate after his departure. In one cold stroke of ink and legal jargon, James had attempted to rewrite our marriage not as fraud, but as partnership. He was once again manipulating perception, only this time with lawyers instead of lies. I felt no fear, only disgust, but disgust can still exhaust you. I sat at the edge of my bed, the letter trembling slightly in my hands, and realized that this man, this predator in polished shoes, had not left because he had been defeated. He had left to regroup, and now he was trying to rob me not with charm, but with litigation. But what he failed to understand was that I had not returned to fragility after his departure. I had not softened. I had hardened, tempered like steel in fire he himself had ignited. I handed the matter to my legal team, calmly and methodically. I presented the contract he had signed with Charles, the audio recordings, the surveillance photos, and his falsified employment records. I included the documents showing how he had been investigating survivorship loopholes in estate law while claiming to love me. My lawyers prepared a countersuit, citing fraud, coercion, and breach of fiduciary trust. Still, James pressed on. His legal team began requesting interviews, attempting to depose former foundation staff, hoping anyone would imply that he had influence. But no one did. Those who had once shaken his hand now distanced themselves. Whispers began in industry circles. The media, having moved on from the scandal, began sniffing again. Then came the second blow, not legal but personal. James gave an interview. A well-known lifestyle magazine published a story featuring him in muted tones and moody lighting. The piece framed him as a misunderstood outsider, a man caught in the orbit of old money and rigid tradition. He didn't accuse me directly. He was far more skilled than that. He spoke of feeling invisible in our marriage, of trying to contribute, but always being kept at a distance. He spoke of legacy as a cage. of power as something inherited, not earned. To the unaware reader, he appeared reflective, sympathetic, almost tragic. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. He knew he could not win in court, so he turned to public perception. He was trying to soften the narrative, frame himself as a victim of a cold dynasty, a man who had loved too much, too quietly. I read the article once, just once. Then I folded it shut, set it beside my empty teacup, and looked out over the east fields. They were blooming again, wildflowers planted after the first frost. The colors spread like fire across the grass. I remembered my mother teaching me how to sow them as a child. I remembered the smell of earth, of fresh beginnings. I would not let James take even 1 inch of my peace, so I responded not with statements or rebuttals, but with action. I called a press conference, not to address the interview, but to announce the launch of the Wren Legacy Fellowship, a $12 million fund to support women in positions of emerging leadership within philanthropy, heritage conservation, and public service. It was a project I had dreamed of quietly for years, born from my frustrations of being underestimated in a room full of men with louder voices but lesser vision. I stood behind a wooden lectern, beneath the oak trees that had shaded generations of wrens before me, and spoke not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman who had endured it and created something beautiful from the ashes. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in. Applications arrived within days. Journalists asked questions about the project, about my story. But I offered only this, that sometimes the people who try to destroy you are the ones who ultimately define you, but only if you choose to rise rather than retreat. Behind the scenes, James's case fell apart. The judge rejected his claims. The court acknowledged the overwhelming evidence of deception, manipulation, and breach. His petition was dismissed, and my countersuit remained active. In the weeks that followed, his lawyer quietly withdrew from representation. And still, I didn't feel triumph, just a quiet, clean space where fear used to live. James vanished again. The magazines stopped calling. The world moved on. But I did not. I kept building. The retreat for financially abused women welcomed its first residents. The foundation launched a literacy initiative for young girls in rural districts. I began writing again, privately, for myself. Pages that no one would read, reflections on love, trust, danger, and survival, not bitter but honest. Sometimes in the quiet hours of early morning, I walk through the orchard. I breathe in the scent of apple blossoms. I run my fingers along the stone walls that line the paths my ancestors once laid. I no longer feel haunted by the past. I feel held by it. Not every legacy is worth preserving, but this one is. Because I am no longer the woman he chose. I am the woman he failed to destroy. Freedom doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes on an ordinary morning, wrapped in quiet, with nothing more than the sound of birds in the trees and your own breath unburdened for the first time in years. It had been 16 months since James walked out of my life, 12 since the court dismissed his claims, and 3 since the media lost interest in our saga. What lingered was no longer his presence, but the echo of the storm he had brought and the profound stillness that followed it. I had not remarried. I had not even dated. That part of me remained untouched, not out of fear, but because I no longer felt the need to fill space for the sake of not being alone. There was something deeply empowering about solitude, true, chosen solitude, that no companionship, however charming, could replace. I spent my days leading the foundation, overseeing our new programs, and writing quietly in the evenings. But something still stirred in me, not sadness, not regret, but the strange urge to understand the ending, not for James, not for Charles, but for me. I returned to the guest house one morning in early fall, the same house we had once shared, the one where he kept his suits folded in perfect order, the one where his scent had lingered in the fabric of the curtains for far too long after he was gone. I had avoided it for over a year, reluctant to disturb its stillness, unsure whether opening that door would reopen wounds I had spent months closing. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had survived worse than silence. The house was exactly as I remembered it. Clean, cold, precise. A museum of false memories. I moved slowly through the rooms, touching nothing at first. The bed was made. The photos were gone. Even the coffee mugs had been boxed and stored. It had been cleaned professionally after his exit, but something of him still clung to the place, not physically, but emotionally, like a fingerprint that can't be scrubbed. I opened the drawer of his desk. Inside, I found the remnants of his last days there. Notes, a calendar, scraps of receipts from dinners I had never attended. But at the very bottom, beneath a manila envelope I almost overlooked, there was a notebook, plain, black, leather-bound. I didn't recognize it, which meant it hadn't been there when I had the place cleaned. It must have been added later, tucked in, perhaps during one of his last visits to retrieve personal belongings. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I opened it. The pages were filled with his handwriting, tight, angled, deliberate. At first, it read like a journal, observations, reflections, but it was more calculated than emotional. There were entries that listed my routines, times I left the estate, names of people I trusted. He had written things about my sleep patterns, about the days I received legal documents, about who visited me and when. And then the entries shifted, after our separation, after his failed lawsuit. These were no longer clinical but broken, angry, unfiltered. He raged against me in ink, calling me cold, manipulative, a gatekeeper of undeserved power. He accused me of ruining his life, of stealing the empire he had almost earned. He wrote that I had tricked him, that I had become something worse than anything he had expected, a woman with control. But then on the last page, his tone changed. He wrote about my eyes, about the night I had kissed his forehead without saying a word just before everything unraveled. He wrote that for a moment he had believed I might forgive him. And that terrified him more than the lawsuit, more than the press, more than being exposed. Because if I had forgiven him, it would mean I still loved him, and he would no longer be able to pretend he never loved me back. I closed the notebook and set it gently back in the drawer. I didn't need it. I didn't need any of it. Understanding him no longer mattered. His chaos, his manipulation, his cowardice, all of it was behind me. What remained now was space, and I finally had enough of it to breathe without the taste of ashes on my tongue. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves danced across the lawn, caught in currents I couldn't see. I stood on the porch for a long while, letting the air move around me. The estate was quiet, but not the suffocating quiet of morning. It was the quiet of continuity, of peace restored. My mother's roses bloomed late that year. My father had returned to sketching again, filling his notebooks with charcoal studies of birds and riverbanks and the creases in old hands. The staff laughed more now. The day of the final hearing came in winter. Not the court case, no, that had already closed, but the final legal process of the countersuit. My attorneys had pursued it not for monetary gain, but for record, for closure, for truth inscribed in legal permanence. James did not appear. His attorney submitted a motion to settle quietly. We declined. We wanted the record to be complete. The court ruled in my favor. It stated plainly what had already been proven, that James Blackwell had entered into the marriage under false pretenses, that he had conspired to defraud a private estate, and that he had acted in violation of multiple fiduciary duties. The ruling was not just symbolic. It stripped him of any future right to claim association with the Wren family or its legacy. The estate would remain untouched by his name. His story would forever be footnoted by that verdict. And then it was over. I walked alone from the courthouse. There were no photographers, no reporters, no congratulations, just the sound of my heels on old concrete and the cold breath of winter pressing against my coat. But I was not hollow. I was whole, not triumphant, just clean. That kind of clarity doesn't roar, it hums softly beneath the surface of every moment that follows. I returned to the estate that evening and made tea, chamomile, my mother's favorite. I walked to the library, lit a fire, and sat in her old chair by the window. I did not open a book. I didn't need distraction. I simply let myself be still. I listened to the creak of the floors, the crackle of the fire, the way the house exhaled around me like it too had been holding its breath for too long. I thought about the woman I had been when I first met James. Young still, though she thought herself wise. Capable yet lonely, powerful but uncertain. And I thought about the woman I had become not because of him, but in spite of him. I no longer mistook trust for weakness or love for surrender. I no longer believed that to be worthy I had to be chosen. I had chosen myself. Weeks passed. The seasons turned again. I traveled less. I stayed grounded. I built a small writing studio in the orchard, and in it I began to write not memoirs, not vengeance, but fiction, stories of women like me and not like me, stories that healed more than they hurt. And in time, the past no longer felt like a wound, but like a story I could hold gently in my hands and set down whenever I chose. I never heard from James again. Some said he left the country permanently. Others claimed he rebranded himself under another name, seeking fortunes in cities where no one recognized his face. But I no longer cared. His disappearance was not absence, it was justice. And as for me, I stayed. I stayed in the home that raised me. I stayed in the legacy I reclaimed. I stayed with the version of myself I had fought so hard to become. And I was free.